This week on To the Contrary.
First, Western women recruiting others to join the jihad. Then, women's colleges accepting transgender students. Behind the headlines, why the LGBT movement makes gains while women's rights are slipping.
Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the bride of ISIS.
The parents of a 20-year-old British woman say they were shocked to learn she's a female jihadist recruiting Western girls to join the movement. They're called bedroom radicals because these women do not act directly as martyrs or political activists. Instead, their roles are getting married to and childbearing for ISIS fighters. Aqsa Mahmood was known in her Glasgow suburb as a sweet and peaceful girl, but she ran off to Syria last year, reportedly marrying a jihadist fighter. Mahmood is one of at least 50 British women and girls who have joined the movement. An online campaign uses social media to encourage others to copy the act of other militants, such as the Boston Marathon bombers. Many are wondering if these so-called jihad sisters will eventually carry out terrorist attacks of their own.
So, Francesca Chambers, what is it that makes Western-born and raised girls join the jihad?
Well, I think it's important to note that it's only a few men relatively overall. This is a phenomenon. This is not widespread.
Agree, and it's a few women, and it shouldn't be used as an excuse to further discriminate against Muslim women, and I'm afraid it will.
I think at this stage, I agree with the two ladies that it is a very unpredictable and scarce type of occurrence.
It's a few women, it's unpredictable, but it's something that needs to be looked into.
Right. I mean, we're talking about, in terms of the men, because we don't really have that many figures yet on the women, but there are about 260 former Brits or British-born citizens with British passports fighting for ISIS or ISIL in Syria, and about 100 Americans, according to Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel this week. How many do you think of the women there are?
I mean, that's a good question. They are,
and you're covering this issue.
I have been covering this issue for the Daily Mail, and I think the big problem is determining how many of the people that are over there are, in fact, people who might have terrorist ties, or they're just people who are traveling over there. And the government's been having a difficult time trying to do that both here and in Britain.
So what should be done about it? Because apparently, you know, these are, you mentioned the possibility of discrimination against Islamic immigrants to the UK or to the US. But what do you do about it? I mean, these are middle class, lower middle class parents who came over from places like Somalia to the UK, I'm talking about now. And their daughters and some of their sons just went really bad. What is the best way to stop that? Should they have their passports revoked? Should they be thrown in jail if they come back to their country of birth? What?
Well, Britain actually introduced legislation this past week to handle that. They're going to now be doing exactly what you suggested, putting their passports on hold until they can do a thorough investigation to determine whether they do have ties with terrorist networks or not.
And what's the lure for the girls?
You know,
I mean, are they just lonely, because they were raised in conservative religious homes, were they given little exposure to the outside? And so some guy comes along in a situation where they're not meeting many men because they're clustered away from them, and all of a sudden they think this is romantic and wonderful?
Well, it's different for each individual case, but I do think that you make a very good point there. In the case of the girl that was talked about during the segment, you know, her friends discussed how they weren't allowed to date. They were put in situations where they had arranged marriages. And so, and I'm not trying to make a leap here, but just speaking to your point, if you're in a situation where you're going to have to marry someone via arranged marriage, it isn't a huge jump to then say, I'm going to fly off somewhere and meet some, you know, and marry someone else I've never ever met.
What about they're tweeting to each other? A lot of these girls are tweeting. Why can't we find them? Well, if they're tweeting, they've got a computer that they're using somewhere that can be traced.
Well, I think we all have justifiable reasons to be afraid that, in fact, we can be found on the basis of our internet activity based on other revelations that have come out in the press. But I think with the tweeting and the Tumblr, and I think, interestingly, this makes me think a bit about Thinspiration here in the United States, and I'm not conflating terrorism and self-harm in any way. However, I think it's interesting that you have these communities of people who are able to come together on the internet and build up a justification for doing these horrible things, either to themselves or to other people.
Clara, welcome to the program, by the way. You've spent a long time studying the Middle East. What would be the best way, do you think, to deal with particularly the women who've gone over? If they decide, as many of the men are now telling Scotland Yard, they went over, they're not happy, it's not the heaven that they were promised it would be, they're being not given much food, horrible accommodations, and then fighting and killing people, all different kinds of Muslims, as well, you know, they're fighting against other Muslim groups, not just against Assad in Syria. So do we use those people who want to come back and send them back into their home where they were born in the UK and the US and get them to describe to others in their neighborhoods how horrible it really is if you do this? Or do we prevent them from coming back? What's better?
Well, you raise a number of different but important points, Bonnie, and thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, today. For the most part, I think the irony of this situation is that you have some very strong and courageous Arab and Iranian women that are coming to the United States describing how terrible the conditions are, how the two faces with which they have to live their lives, the public face has to be quiet and silent about the atrocities. The private faces share what's going on. So I really am convinced that only a handful of Western women or women from the UK will make the journey over there. There must be some flaws in their thinking, a romanticized version of an adventure of what meets them over there that really precipitates the journey over there.
What about sexual abuse? Is that, I mean, are they being,
once they get over there?
Have they been, well, before? Are they rape victims who
it's conceivable
who are trying to escape that?
It's conceivable. What happens, I think, happens mentally. So there must be some type of reaction similar to a cult follower, or perhaps someone that engages in violent behavior. Has that potential. It's impossible to see beforehand. How do you monitor it? By seeing their social media and Twitter activity, but essentially most of the time you can't prevent. You can only take action after things happen, but I'm convinced it'll only be a handful of Western women that will make the journey.
I think what's really interesting about this is when you said that you can't prevent, some of the women, they're teenagers, they're in their early 20s, they're living at home with their families. And I think that it's a responsibility of the parents to monitor what it is that your children are doing under your roof. And so the story of the young woman that we heard, she started to withdraw from her friends, she started to withdraw from her school, she was spending a lot of time alone in her room. And as a parent, you want to ask, what are you doing? Where are you going? You can look at the history of your child's phone to see what sites they've been on and what they've been doing, and get them the help that they need and start to have conversations that are out in the open, because these young women, they're going to these social media sites, they're going to these places because they want community. And there's a reason why they feel like they have a lack of that connection, and I think that it's up to their parents to take a responsibility to figure out what's missing.
Well, is that a message that's easier to convey to parents here in the United States, and when we're talking first-generation immigrants, for the most part, from the Middle East, from Arab countries, is that easier to get to that message to the community here or the one in England?
I'm not sure where it would be easier, but you have to understand that these people that are leaving their countries, the first-generation immigrants, it's because they want to provide a better life for their families, whether it's they're fleeing from war, famine, better job security, all of these different things that move people from their home country to another place. And so they do that with the belief that their children are going to have better lives than they did. And so it's about having that open kind of conversation and saying, what kind of world am I opening up for my children by bringing bringing them to the UK or bringing them to the United States and having to be vigilant, because no one wants to bring that type of shame onto their family, of their children fleeing and going back to either, going into terrorist land and participating in that. There's already so much stigma that families have, first-generation families, of Islamic families and what have you, that are coming in, that they don't want that burden put back on them.
All right. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter @BonnieUrbay or @ToTheContrary. From terrorism to transgender students.
The president of Mount Holyoke, one of the most respected women's colleges in the country, announced this week the school is formally accepting transgender students. The announcement was met with an enthusiastic reception.
Our new policy formally welcomes applications from any qualified student who is female or who identifies as a woman.
Mount Holyoke is the second women's college to do so after Mills College in Oakland, California, earlier this month. While transgender women were not formally excluded before, they were also not formally welcomed. School officials said they feared not having an explicit welcoming policy discouraged transgender students.
We recognize that what it means to be a woman is not static.
So, and she also said, by the way, Erin, that a woman is not defined by her body. Your thoughts on what kind of message that is?
Love it. This is fantastic news for students everywhere. And it's really an important turning point in how we start to think about gender in society more broadly, as well as within specifically women's spaces, in the women's movement, women's colleges, and beyond. And it's important to note that, women includes transgender women, unequivocally, full stop. And it's important to take affirmative steps to make sure that people feel welcome. I don't think it's just assumed. Being transgender is associated with, for example, enormously high suicide rates. In fact, more than 40% of transgender individuals have attempted suicide at some point.
What is it for among the general population?
That's a good question. I can tell you it's 9 times as much. Don't make me do math on TV. But anyway,
but it's 9 times as much among transgender.
9 times everyone else. And I can also say that transgender people are often disproportionately victims of violence. In fact, people who've been murdered in hate crimes, 45% of them are transgender women. And so we need to have a serious conversation about gender and making sure that we include transgender people in all of the advances we're making toward equality.
Is there any downside to this? Are there people who may have wanted to attend Holyoke or Mills who will be turned off and not want to go?
Well, I think it's up to private institutions to decide if that's something that they think will encourage more people to come to that university. And if they believe that that won't be a turnoff, good for them. But if they also, other women's colleges don't want to do that, I can understand why they might not want to put a policy like that in place. Just like some of the traditional black universities or the traditional men's universities or other, generally throughout time, there's been plenty of universities that have been for a specific type of person in the country, and they might not want to accept different people for a number of reasons.
I want to offer a different perspective, too, that the notion that a woman shouldn't be recognized for her body, or I actually want to say that I'm very proud to be a woman, and I'd like to be identified as a woman, and I like to identify all the gains that we've made as women and will continue to be made as women. So I'm a little bit put off by the notion, and I think a lot of women may be put off by the notion that that essentially somehow we can't be identified that way. I'm identified culturally, I'm identified by my age, and I'm identified by women. So those marks shouldn't be viewed as negatives. I think they should be positives. I'm open-minded to the transgender issue, but not open-minded to all of a sudden not acknowledging my genetic advantage being a woman.
But how is accepting someone and not discriminating against someone somehow an attack upon you as a woman? Truly, I'd like to hear more about that, because it's clear that discriminating against people is just discriminating against people. It's not building you up. In fact, it's dragging us all down together. And so I'm just not clear how that hurts you.
I'm looking at the glass half full. What I'm saying is that to say that I'm not identified as a woman my body is not part of that description, to me, is not only is it not scientifically accurate, it's not emotionally, it doesn't resonate with me. Now, again, I've seen the transition of how women went past girdles to, all of a sudden, all the physical changes that have happened. And I think I want to champion and celebrate our accomplishments as women and expand the pie to include, certainly transgender, but not necessarily shift.
I think that it's important to, I think what Mount Holyoke did and what Mills College did is incredibly important and needed. Transgender women, people are discriminated against, and college is about exploration of self and about discovering how you want to stand in your own skin, how you want to build the society around you. And I think by them making this policy change, allows people to feel like they matter, that their lives matter, how they think matters. And historically, transgender people are on the margins of society. And so this allows them at these particular schools to feel like they are accepted for who they are. In terms of identifiers, people should be able to identify themselves how they view themselves. And it's the rest of us are to respect that decision and how they choose to identify what pronouns they want to use, whether they want to be identified by gender or not. But I think that it's important that we as people respect what the choices that we as individuals should make.
All right. 2 wins and 1 loss. This week, a unanimous panel of judges struck down a ban on same-sex marriages in Wisconsin and Indiana, declaring the laws unconstitutional. But a federal judge in Louisiana upheld that state's ban on gay marriage. It was the first court loss for LGBTQ groups following a long string of victories. Behind the headlines, analysts say gay rights are advancing, while women's rights are experiencing defeats. Could a reframing of the movement be the key to advancement?
The LGBTQ movement took a lesson from the civil rights movement, which in part was, of course, it was a legal movement about civil rights. But in large part, this was a moral, religious movement about the dignity of African Americans and the personhood and humanity of African Americans. I do think there can be a lesson from the success of the LGBTQ movement.
After this summer's Supreme Court Hobby Lobby ruling, activist and scholar Jay Michaelson says he examined why women are losing rights while the LGBTQ community is gaining.
Hobby Lobby became about contraception instead of dignity and equality of all people, including women. It's about legal rights. It's not about the fact that now women are separate and unequal under the law, where their employers can make certain healthcare decisions for them. As a man, there's not a single healthcare decision that I have that my employer gets to make for me.
Michaelson attended the Hobby Lobby oral argument and says he saw 2 things he found disappointing.
One is that it was all men on one side, and the only people who seemed to be vocally in favor of the women employees at issue in the case were the 3 female justices. The second dispiriting moment was when Anthony Kennedy said, "This is really about abortion." And that's when we knew that Hobby Lobby was going to win, the government was going to lose.
Michaelson says the women's movement faces resistance due to difficulty in putting forth a message that women's health is about identity and dignity, and that conservative women are in an ideological battle with liberal women.
You're not going to find a whole lot of African Americans who are against civil rights. You're not going to find a lot of LGBT people who are against same-sex marriage and LGBT equality. There are actually women on the other side, Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, many, many others, who claim not to be feminists or who are anti-choice and who take a number of positions that many in the sort of women's equality, women's rights movement would call anti-women.
Michaelson says humanizing an issue makes it resonate. He says sharing personal stories could result in more acceptance and understanding of such a complex issue.
Unfortunately, abortion is rarely a joyful experience like same-sex marriage is. Nonetheless, there need to be stories of triumph and challenge, and stories that people can relate to from human beings who are unafraid of the shaming that comes from the right.
Whether it's reframing or sharing personal stories, a change in perspective may be what the women's movement needs to move forward.
It is true that I think what Gloria Steinem said, that feminism at its heart is humanism, and yet that identity frame has not yet been successfully adopted in this struggle.
So do you agree, first of all, Danielle, that LGBTQ movement has made gains, whereas the women's movement, certainly in terms of things like access to reproductive health, is falling backwards?
I do think that the LGBTQ movement has made incredible gains. I mean, but to his point, Jay Michaelson's point, it's because of the stories. It's because of the stories that we've learned to tell. For a variety of reasons, my wife and I got engaged in the marriage equality fight in Washington, D.C. because people like us, who looked like us, that were African American, that were lesbian, were not a part of the conversation, and they weren't part of the images of same-sex marriage that were being shown. And so it's important to invoke empathy and have a conversation about real lived experiences and bring those stories to the forefront.
And that's a great story. But let me also say that Kate Michelman, who was head of NARAL for many years, 15 or 20 years, she left about 5 years ago, but she talked repeatedly about having 3 kids, being Catholic, so she was, had moral qualms about abortion. Her husband left her. She was pregnant with a 4th. She could not support the 3 she had. She went out there and told that story 1 million times on national TV, in books, blah, 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 blah. And there are others. So it's not as if the stories aren't being told.
It's
now,
the way
but let me, Michelson suggests framing it, as the LGBTQ movement has done, as a matter of dignity. Instead of saying women need access to abortion, just frame it. Would it help the movement if it framed it as a matter of dignity? My body is, you men get to do whatever they want medically with their bodies, with no restrictions. Nice Freudian slip. But women do not. Why would that help?
I think because, frankly, society does not trust women. We don't trust women to take care of their bodies, to lead companies, to be heads of households. We just don't. And I think that these laws and the conversations that we're having is about dignity, just as well as the LGBTQ movement shifted the conversation around marriage equality, around love and family.
And dignity.
And dignity. We need to shift the same conversation around women's rights and women's bodies, about dignity and respect and ownership, right? Because what we did with the Hobby Lobby case is give ownership of women's bodies and choices to their employers, because they're too feeble in order to make the decisions themselves.
But as someone who has been steeped in the conservative movement, as someone who started a conservative publication for a long time, what you just did right there is exactly the reason why you're losing conservative women. A lot of conservative women can get behind the idea that men make more than women and it's unfair. But when you start putting that in the same category as abortion, then you start to lose people who would otherwise be on your side
women's health
about
isn't
women's
just
rights.
about abortion.
I understand
and that's the problem.
I understand
though.
but
that's the exact problem, is that when we talk about but it's not nuanced, because women's reproductive health is not simply about abortion. And the Hobby Lobby case was about a woman being able to decide the timeline when she wanted to have a family and have the contraception in order to do so.
It's not simply about abortion.
So let me ask you this. You're saying that progressive women should just drop, the only way that they're going to get conservative women on board is if they drop the whole reproductive rights issue, period.
I'm not saying that they should drop the issue or give up their values in any way.
Well, how should they frame it then to win people like you?
I'm saying that they would be better off getting more conservative women on board if they didn't put the two in the same category and put them in the same sentence and say, if you're not for this and this and this and this, then you're against women's rights. Whereas I think that they're all very separate issues, and you could probably get more women on board with the other.
And the Hobby Lobby case, also, just to clarify, clarify, covered 14 types of birth control. They didn't cover the morning after pill. And that essentially is what's being discussed here, that has an issue with some conservative organizations and women about morning after pill and abortion issues.
Untrue. It's all forms of contraception. The Supreme Court clarified with that. Second, I fail to see the nuance in stepping in and violating a woman's human rights when she has said, I've decided to end this pregnancy, and trying to stop her. But I think one thing that I want to raise, Jay raises a number of important points that I agree with strongly. But I do think we should also be aware that it takes a white man so that we listen to them and talk about them.
It takes it, meaning
the fact that he is a white man, and we're listening to that idea and talking about it, but I want to acknowledge that, often we devalue women's voices so much that we don't even let women speak about what's best for women in the women's movement.
But so we pay more attention when it's a guy,
white man,
and specifically
precisely.
a white man. Interesting. That's it for this edition, but there's some fodder for thought. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. Whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week. I mean, I think it's fascinating.